The villagers of Elmswood often spoke of the haunting melody that drifted through the woods after sundown. It was a low, melancholic whistle, carrying an inexplicable weight of sadness. No one knew where it came from, but every household locked their doors tight at dusk, for it was said that those who dared to follow the sound never return. On a crisp autumn evening, young Clara stood at her attic window, the golden glow of her candle flickering against the glass. She had just returned from university for the holidays and dismissed the tales as old folklore meant to scare children. But as the clock struck 9, the whistle began. It was faint at first, a single note stretching across the quiet night. Her heart quickened, not from fear, but curiosity. "Come on, Clara," she whispered to herself. "It's just the wind or someone playing tricks." She pulled on her coat and grabbed a flashlight, determined to prove there was no ghost. The forest loomed dark and silent as she stepped onto the narrow path. The whistle grew louder, its tune now complex and deliberate. Clara paused, glancing back at the warm lights of her home. For a moment, she considered turning around. But something in the melody pulled her forward, a strange familiarity she couldn't quite place. As the trees closed in around her, the whistling stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustling of leaves. And then, a voice, soft and trembling, whispered her name, Clara. Clara Mason had always been the skeptic in her family. Growing up in Elmswood, she'd heard all the tales, the whistler who lured wanderers into the woods, the ghostly figure seen at the edge of the lake, and the mysterious disappearances that followed the sound of the haunting melody. Her parents had drilled the warnings into her as a child, but Clara never believed them. Science and logic were her guiding stars, and superstition had no place in her world. Her return to Elmswood was bittersweet. The town hadn't changed much in the years she'd been away. The cobblestone streets were still uneven, the local bakery still sold the same buttery pastries, and the woods still stood like an impenetrable fortress at the edge of the village. But Clara had changed. The weight of her academic ambitions and the constant pressure to succeed had taken a toll, and she'd come home seeking peace and escape from the chaos of city life. Her parents, however, remained as cautious as ever. That evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, her mother had mentioned the whistler in hushed tones. "It's been worse lately," she said, her eyes darting to the window as if the sound might creep in. "People have heard it every night for the past week. Old Mr. Turner's dog went missing 2 days ago, and there's talk that—" "Mom," Clara interrupted with a soft laugh, "you're scaring yourself. It's just an old story." Her father's expression darkened. "Clara, this is serious. You may not believe it, but something isn't right out there. Promise us you won't go near the woods." Clara nodded to appease them, but her mind was already racing with questions. Why had the stories persisted for so long? And why did the whistle seem to affect everyone so profoundly? That night, as she lay in bed, the faint tune began to drift through the air. Her first instinct was to dismiss it, a trick of the wind, perhaps. But as the notes grew clearer, her chest tightened. The melody was oddly familiar, like a lullaby she'd heard in a dream. Against her better judgment, she rose from her bed, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Clara stepped outside, the cool night air biting her skin. The forest loomed ahead, its shadows stretching long and dark beneath the pale moonlight. The whistle called to her, weaving through the trees like a phantom. She hesitated, clutching her flashlight as her heart pounded. The path into the woods was narrow, lined with gnarled branches that seemed to reach out like skeletal hands. She paused at the edge, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Just a quick look," she whispered. "There's nothing to be afraid of." But as she stepped onto the path, A strange sensation washed over her, a mix of dread and familiarity, as if she were returning to a place she'd been before. The deeper Clara ventured into the woods, the more the air seemed to change. It grew heavier, colder, and unnaturally still. Even the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, were absent. The only sound was the whistle, now clearer than ever. It danced through the trees, its melody lilting and mournful, like a voice calling from another world. Clara's flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam bouncing off twisted roots and damp earth. She followed the sound, her steps careful but steady, her curiosity overpowering her growing unease. As she moved further in, she noticed something strange. The trees around her bore deep scratches, as though clawed by something far larger than any animal she knew. Her stomach tightened, but she pressed on. "There's an explanation for all of this," she muttered under her breath, though the words felt hollow in the silence. Then, she saw it, a faint, glowing light ahead. It flickered like a lantern, its glow warm and inviting against the oppressive darkness. Clara froze. Every rational part of her screamed to turn back, to retreat to the safety of her home. But the whistle grew louder, and the light seemed to pulse in time with the melody, beckoning her forward. As she approached, the light resolved into a small clearing, illuminated by an old rusted lamp post that looked impossibly out of place. Beneath it stood a figure. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be. He was tall and thin, with a face partially obscured by shadows. He wore a tattered coat, and his head was tilted downward, as if he were studying the ground. In his hand was a wooden flute, worn and weathered with age. The whistle's haunting melody emanated from the instrument, though the man's fingers were still. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but no words came. As if sensing her presence, the man slowly lifted his head. His eyes, pale and unearthly, locked onto hers, and Clara felt as though the air had been sucked from her lungs. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice low and hollow, like wind passing through a tunnel. Clara stammered, her voice trembling. "I heard the whistle. I wanted to see." The man's expression darkened. "You should not have come." Before she could respond, the whistle changed. The mournful tune twisted into something sharp and discordant, a sound that pierced her ears and sent shivers down her spine. The clearing seemed to shift around her, the trees swaying unnaturally as the light from the lamppost dimmed. The man stepped closer, his pale eyes glinting in the dim light. "Do you know what happens to those who follow the sound?" he asked, his voice laced with sorrow. Clara shook her head, her heart hammering. "What is this? Who are you?" "I am what remains," he said cryptically, his gaze flickering to the flute in his hand. "A warning, bound to this place by a mistake long forgotten. But you shouldn't be here." The air around her seemed to hum with energy, and Clara felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to flee. Yet she was rooted to the spot, as though the melody itself held her captive. "Please," she managed to whisper, "tell me what's happening." But the man's face contorted with something between anger and pain. "Leave now," he said, his voice rising, "before it's too late." The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the trees seemed to close in. The whistle grew louder, nearly unbearable, and Clara turned, her instincts finally overriding her curiosity. She ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she stumbled back through the forest. Behind her, the whistle followed, no longer a melody but a cacophony of discordant notes. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she burst from the trees and into the open air, collapsing onto the dirt path that led back to her home. The whistle stopped. The night was silent once more, but Clara knew the mystery was far from over. Clara spent the next day haunted by the events in the woods. She told no one, not even her parents, fearing they'd dismiss her story as the product of an overactive imagination. But the man's words echoed in her mind, a warning, bound to this place by a mistake long forgotten. Determined to uncover the truth, Clara spent hours in the town's small library, poring over old records and newspapers. She found whispers of disappearances dating back over a century, travelers, villagers, even children, all vanishing without a trace near the forest. But one story stood out, that of a musician named Elias Whittaker, who lived on the outskirts of Elmswood nearly 100 years ago. Elias had been renowned for his talent with the flute, his melodies said to be so beautiful they could make even the coldest heart weep. But tragedy struck when his wife, Annabelle, fell ill and died during a harsh winter. Overcome with grief, Elias began playing a mournful tune every night, wandering the forest in search of solace. One fateful evening, he disappeared. The locals believed Elias had been consumed by his sorrow, his spirit bound to the melody he'd played for Annabelle. Over time, his tale morphed into the legend of the Whistler, his song luring the lost and the curious into the woods. That night, Clara couldn't stay away. Armed with this knowledge and a resolve to understand what bound Elias's spirit, she returned to the forest. The whistle greeted her as soon as she stepped onto the path, softer now, almost inviting. This time, she wasn't afraid. The melody seemed to guide her, leading her back to the clearing with the old lamp post. The man, Elias, was there, his pale eyes filled with the same sorrow she'd seen the night before. "You came back," he said, his voice a whisper. "I know who you are," Clara replied. "Elias Whittaker." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, and the corners of his mouth turned up in the faintest hint of a smile. "So, the story survives." "I read about you," she continued. "About Annabelle, is she why you're here?" His gaze dropped to the flute in his hand. "I played for her every night," he said softly. "When she passed, I thought the music would keep her close, but it became a curse. The melody grew darker, twisted by my grief. Now it binds me to this place, forcing me to call others to their end, just as I was called to mine." Clara's breath caught. "But why me? Why did the whistle sound so familiar?" Elias hesitated before answering. "Because you are tied to this place, as I am, my song reaches those it senses. A connection forged through blood and memory. You must be a descendant." The revelation sent a chill through Clara. She had heard stories of distant ancestors from Elmswood, but she had never imagined such a connection. "If I'm tied to this, can I help you?" she asked. Elias looked at her, a glimmer of hope breaking through his sorrow. "Perhaps, if you can destroy this," he said, holding up the flute. "It is the vessel of the curse, but be warned, it will not be easy. The forest will fight to protect it." Clara nodded, her resolve firm. "Tell me what to do." Elias handed her the flute, its wood cold and unnaturally heavy in her hands. The moment she touched it, the forest seemed to awaken. The trees groaned, their branches reaching out like claws. The whistle grew deafening, the melody now a chaotic wail. Clara gritted her teeth and ran, clutching the flute as the forest closed in around her. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and heave. At the edge of the woods, she saw it, a small, overgrown gravestone bearing the name Annabelle Whittaker. The melody swirled around her, almost pleading. As she raised the flute, and brought it down with all her strength against the stone. The flute shattered, its pieces scattering like ash. The whistle ceased instantly, leaving behind a silence so profound it was almost disorienting. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the forest stilled. When Clara looked up, Elias was standing before her, his form flickering like a candle flame. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with relief. "You freed me." Tears filled her eyes as she watched him fade, his expression one of peace. The faintest hint of a smile lingered on his face as he disappeared, leaving only the rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Clara stood motionless, the shattered remnants of the flute scattered at her feet. The forest around her, once oppressive and alive with unnatural energy, now seemed calm, almost serene. Moonlight filtered gently through the branches, casting soft shadows on the ground. For the first time since her return to Elmswood, she felt a sense of quiet she hadn't realized she needed. The air was lighter, the woods no longer heavy with the weight of the past. Whatever force had lingered here was gone, freed from its torment. She knelt by Annabelle's gravestone, brushing away the moss that had crept across its surface over the decades. The name and dates etched into the stone were barely visible, but the sentiment behind her act was clear. "I hope you're together now," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The faintest breeze rustled the leaves above, and for a brief moment, she thought she heard the softest echo of a whistle, a new tune, light and joyful, as though Elias's spirit was bidding her farewell. She smiled, her heart heavy yet oddly at ease. When she returned to her parents' house, dawn was breaking. She didn't tell them everything, only that she had walked in the woods and found peace. They didn't press her for details, perhaps sensing that whatever she had faced, she had come out stronger for it. The following days brought an unspoken change to Elmswood. The eerie whistle that had haunted the nights was gone, and the villagers, though unable to explain it, felt the shift. Stories of the whistler persisted, but now they were told as legends rather than warnings, the fear that had gripped the town fading into memory. For Clara, the experience lingered as a reminder of the ties between past and present, of how even the darkest stories could find resolution. She visited Annabelle's grave one last time before leaving Elmswood, laying a single white lily at its base. "Rest well," she murmured. As she turned to go, the forest seemed to watch her, not with malice, but with quiet acknowledgement. And as Clara walked away, the woods behind her remained silent, finally at peace with the song that had ended at last.